In September 1907, a federal surveyor named A.C. Seiler documented a conversation with an elderly Cherokee man known as Sally Crow. During that conversation, Crow described something very specific. He said there were tunnels beneath the Great Smoky Mountains, not caves formed by erosion, constructed passages that were already there before the Cherokee arrived. That detail is where the entire discussion begins, because it immediately removes one explanation. The Cherokee didn't build these tunnels, they encountered them. Crow didn't describe a single opening or an isolated chamber. He described a system, passages running from the higher elevations of the mountains down toward the lower lands, forming connected routes through the region. Not random voids in rock, but something organized. According to his account, some of the entrances were known early on. They weren't hidden at first. The Cherokee came across them, entered parts of the system, and understood enough to make a decision about what to do next. They chose not to use it. Crow was clear about the reason. It wasn't fear. It was restraint, as if the tunnels were recognized as something that didn't belong to them. That response stands out, because if a group finds something that provides movement, shelter, or advantage, it usually becomes part of daily life. It gets expanded or reused. Here, the opposite happened. Over time, many of the entrances were deliberately sealed, not collapsed naturally, closed with enough precision that they became difficult to locate unless you already knew where to look. Crow also mentioned what was found inside. Not in full detail, but enough to understand the situation. There were objects made of stone that didn't match the materials found in that region. Markings along the walls, extending through sections of the passage. And deeper areas that were left unexplored beyond a certain point. That last part is where the account becomes more specific, because choosing not to continue deeper into a structure is usually based on what's already been seen. Now compare that to what is officially documented about the Smoky Mountains. In 1929, a geological survey conducted during the early formation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park recorded vertical shaft formations in the Chilhowee Mountain area. The survey notes described them as anomalous, with indications of shaping near their openings, rather than purely natural erosion. Those findings were flagged for further study. No follow-up was carried out. Modern geological descriptions of the region focus on natural processes, uplift, erosion, and sediment layers formed over hundreds of millions of years. They do not include large-scale constructed tunnel systems, so there's a clear mismatch, a recorded account describing structured passages, and a formal record that doesn't account for them at all. At that point, the question becomes more precise, not just where the tunnels came from, but what exactly was inside them that led to that decision to seal and leave them. Crow's account gives the outline, but not the full description. He describes enough to identify the structure and the response to it. He does not go further. And that gap isn't unique to this one conversation. Decades before 1907, a Smithsonian researcher named James Mooney spent years documenting Cherokee traditions. In his field notes, he recorded a consistent pattern. Certain topics would cause conversations to stop immediately, not because people didn't understand the question, but because they chose not to answer it. One of those topics was the underground passages in the Smoky Mountain region. Mooney never got a direct explanation. Seiler, in 1907, got part of one, which raises the next question. What was known well enough to stay silent about for decades, but only partially described when that silence finally started to break? Mooney had already identified where the boundary was, but he never got past it. By the time Seiler recorded that 1907 conversation, that same boundary was still in place, only slightly shifted. For years, direct questions about what lay beneath the Smoky Mountains led nowhere. Then, without any public explanation, a partial account appears. Not enough to explain everything, but enough to confirm that the subject itself was real. That gap between silence and description is where the pattern becomes visible. The tunnels were not unknown. They were recognized, but the details surrounding them were limited in a consistent way. That consistency matters more than any single statement, because it shows that the information wasn't lost over time. It was being controlled. Now go back to what Crow actually described. He didn't talk about scattered openings or isolated caves. He described a system, something that ran through the mountains, connecting higher elevations to lower ground without relying on the surface. That kind of structure doesn't function as a temporary shelter or a natural void. It functions as infrastructure. Movement changes inside a system like that. Distance is reduced. Exposure disappears. Travel becomes independent of weather, terrain, or visibility. That's not a feature you build casually, and it's not something that develops naturally without direction. It suggests planning, and more importantly, it suggests purpose. Crow places that system earlier than the Cherokee presence in the region. Already there, already formed, already in use at some point before it was found. That places the construction in a different phase of the landscape's history, one that doesn't appear clearly in the standard explanations of the region. Then there's the response to it. The system wasn't ignored. It was entered, explored to a certain extent, understood enough to make a decision, and then it was left alone. Not abandoned in the sense of being forgotten, but deliberately avoided. Entrances were sealed. Access became limited. The structure remained in place, but it wasn't incorporated into daily use. That kind of response isn't random. If something is useful, it tends to be reused, expanded, adapted, made part of the environment. That didn't happen here. Instead, the system was left intact, but separated from regular activity. Crow also described what was found inside, and those details narrow things further. Stone materials that didn't match the surrounding region. Markings that extended along sections of the walls in repeating patterns, not isolated symbols, but something continuous. That suggests the system wasn't just carved out, it was organized internally. And then there are the deeper sections, the areas that weren't fully explored. That's where the account stops. Not at the entrance, not in the main passages, but further inside. The decision point doesn't sit at the surface, it sits somewhere beyond the parts that were initially accessed. At the same time, parts of the system were already sealed before the Cherokee encountered them. Not collapsed through natural processes, but closed deliberately. That means restriction was built into the structure itself, not added later. So now there are two separate actions that exist before the Cherokee ever arrived. The system was constructed, and sections of it were sealed. That combination changes the direction of the question. It's no longer just about who built the tunnels. It's about why parts of them were intentionally closed, and what existed beyond those closures. Because whatever was inside those deeper sections didn't just stop exploration in one moment. It established a boundary that held across generations, long enough to be recognized by researchers like Mooney, and still partially intact when Seiler recorded Crow's account. There is one more detail that starts to connect this to something physical. In later survey notes from the Smoky Mountain region, there are references to vertical shafts and openings that don't match standard geological formations. These weren't presented as part of a larger system, and they weren't fully investigated, but they align in a very specific way with the kind of structure Crow described. That's where the next step leads. Not just back into the accounts, but into the locations where those descriptions might still connect to something that exists physically beneath the surface. The strongest physical reference in this story doesn't come from speculation. It comes from survey records. In 1929, during early geological work tied to the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a survey team documented a series of vertical shafts in the Chilhowee Mountain area. These weren't described as random sinkholes. The notes specifically mention that the upper edges of some openings appeared shaped, not purely eroded, and at least a few extended deeper than their equipment could measure at the time. The shafts were recorded and marked for further study. That follow-up never happened. The records remained in archive files, largely untouched, and the formations themselves were never fully examined in detail. Now place that next to the earlier account. In 1907, a federal surveyor named A.C. Seiler recorded testimony from an elderly Cherokee man, Sally Crow. Crow described a system beneath the Smoky Mountains, not natural caves, but constructed passages that were already there before the Cherokee arrived. He described them as connected, running from higher elevations toward lower ground, and partially sealed. The connection between those two records is not proof, but it's not random either. Both describe openings in elevated terrain. Both suggest depth beyond what was easily accessible, and both point to something below the surface that wasn't fully explored. There are straightforward explanations for why no large-scale investigation followed. The region became protected land, and subsurface excavation inside a national park is heavily restricted. Geological surveys tend to prioritize surface mapping unless there's a clear, immediate reason to go deeper. So the absence of follow-up isn't unusual by itself, but it does leave the original observations unresolved, and that's where the story settles. On one side, you have a recorded account from 1907 describing a structured system beneath the mountains, including sealed sections and materials that didn't match the surrounding region. On the other, you have a documented survey from 1929 identifying openings in the same general landscape that were never fully investigated. Those two pieces don't complete each other, but they do overlap. And that overlap is where the question stays. Not as a conclusion, but as a boundary. Because if the tunnels described by Crow were real, then the most important parts of that system weren't the entrances. They were the sections that were closed, the areas that weren't explored. And those are the parts that still haven't been examined in any complete way. So the story doesn't end with a discovery. It ends with a gap, a recorded account that stops at a boundary, a survey that identifies openings but doesn't go further, and a region where access, by design, remains limited. If there is anything more to this, it isn't going to come from retelling the same accounts. It would come from looking directly at what's still there and asking the same question in a different way. Not whether something exists, but how much of it has never been fully examined.